payments of $29.99. I'm kidding about the payments, of course. But I'm serious about the rest. I am, I believe there's a small decision that we can make that can impact all those things that I mentioned. And today, I want to talk about the decision to not grumble or complain. It's a simple decision. Um, it may not necessarily be the easiest thing to implement, but it's still a simple decision to make. And I want to begin in Philippians chapter 2. Let's go there. In Philippians 2, verse 14, it says, do everything without grumbling. Okay, I'm going to just pause there, let you read those words, let it soak in, okay? It says do everything, not just some things, not like just your favorite things, not when in the mood, but it says to do everything without grumbling, okay? And, I thought it's probably important that I define what grumbling is. And so here is what grumbling is. It's to complain or protest about something in a bad-tempered but typically muted way, right? And as you kind of think about that for yourself, grumbling is, in my life, quite a bit. It's the things that we mutter under our breath, right? It's the it's all this secret displeasure that maybe we don't openly share or communicate, or we do with certain other people. It's when we express annoyance, when we express frustration, it's resentment or anger expressed about maybe a person or people. Or a situation, an organization or an event. I can think of myself when I was a teen saying things like, oh, that's so unfair, or who do they think I am? I'm not their slave. I remember all those grumbling thoughts or words being expressed under my breath. I think about working in the secular field and being in the office. We would have meetings and then come back to our desks, and all the complaining would begin. It's like, oh, I can't believe they want us to do that, and we'd be talking back and forth amongst ourselves about all the ways that we hate the policies that our company has or things of that nature. It's as a husband saying things like, oh, why did she do that? Or why is this always like that? And I think if we're honest with ourselves, grumbling is one of these things, complaining, that's incredibly pervasive. It's in every arena of life. Everybody does it, and including us as disciples, we can complain about everything, and I'm talking about making a simple decision, no more grumbling and complaining. And my hope is that by the end of this lesson, you would feel inspired and motivated to make such a decision. But I think one of the things that you're going to realize, as I've kind of been wrestling with this lesson this week, is the moment you decide that you're not going to grumble and complain, you're going to start to realize just how much you grumble and complain. It's kind of like, in the early days of COVID, when all the news was coming out about different ways to combat or not get sick. They talked about not touching your face. And I remember kind of saying to myself, oh, okay, let me try at least and avoid touching my face. And then all of a sudden you become aware of how much you touch your face. It's not like I was doing it more. I was just more aware that I was touching my face so much. When you tweak your back, you become aware of just how much you use the muscles in your back, right? When you have a sore throat, you start to realize, wow, I swallow several times a minute, and so when you decide to not grumble and complain, you're going to notice how much you grumble and complain, so, but we have this verse here that we just looked at, to do everything, not only without grumbling, but it also goes on to say without arguing, okay? And if you think about grumbling and complaining, They are the emotional response. It is the emotional response to frustrations and irritations. And this is the stuff that it spills out, right? So if you think of somebody holding a cup or a pitcher and you've got water in it, hey, when the water is low, it can get jostled around and nothing spill. But if it's near the brim, then it becomes very easy for it to spill out. In the same way with us, it's easy for us when we're filled with frustration or anger or annoyance for that to spill out. And that's the grumbling and the complaining. Um, that's the emotional side. The arguing is the intellectual side. It's the side where we start to construct all the rationale and reasonings around our frustration, why it's there to justify it to ourselves. And then as well, when we vocalize that with other people, we're justifying it with other people. We're trying to get them on side with how we want things to be. So it says to do everything without grumbling or arguing. How do we do this, right? You know, Jesus has some hard teachings. I would say this is one of those hard teachings, right? He heard that from some of his disciples. Wow, this is a hard teaching. I did say it was a simple decision. I didn't say it was an easy decision. So why would God expect something that, you know, if you think about it, I think for a lot of people would seem like an unrealistic expectation. It didn't say, again, do some things. It says do everything without grumbling and arguing. There's so much to complain about. There's so many dumb people out there, right? There's so many things that happen that kind of throw a curveball at us. You know, I was at Tim Hortons earlier this week, and I bought a donut, came home to find out that they charged me $4 for the donut. Needless to say, I was complaining about that. But there's a thing here, when I've been looking through these scriptures, there's a consistent theme between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's this: God reacts very strongly to grumbling and complaining. And as I've thought about it, here's what I've come to understand. I mean, why would God react strongly to something that is caused by external things happening to us? But the more I think about it, the more I realize complaining doesn't come from a problem out there, okay? But from a problem in here, in our hearts. At the root of every frustration that results in complaining, at the root of it is discontentment. Now, it might be triggered by something external to us, right? It could be your mom or your boss or your neighbor or your friend. It could be, you know, how you were treated or the service you received. It could be the amount of work you've got to do. But at the root of all that is discontentment with the situation, the circumstance, or the person. You know, when it's 85 degrees outside and it's sweltering, the humidity's high, I hate it. But I know that there are some of you who you love that. That's just like the best weather on earth, right? It's something that's external to me, and it triggers me. It triggers discontentment in me. But it's not the same for everybody. There are others for whom it doesn't trigger them the same way. So it has to do with something internal. The root is me. The trigger might be the weather, but the root is me. Okay? And so with all of these things, there are things that trigger us. But it's not the problem out there that's the issue. It's the problem that's in here that's the issue. And I think that's why God takes an issue with it. Now, saying all that's fine and dandy, but we're told to do everything without grumbling or arguing or complaining. And the thing about it is, it's not an isolated thing. It's not just this one scripture that Paul wrote in this place. This this idea is all over the Bible. I want to look at a couple, three scriptures really quickly here. Numbers 11 in verse 1, it says, "Now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord, and when he heard them, his anger was aroused." Complaining about hardships, who doesn't complain about their hardships? But we hear God's response here. It says that his anger was aroused. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it says, "And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel." Paul is referencing for the Corinthians another incident of grumbling among the Israelites back then. Not even the one we just read about before, but a separate incident. And it resulted in several Israelites getting killed, it says, by the destroying angel. You get the sense that there's a thing about grumbling and complaining that God doesn't like. Another verse, in James 5, verse 9, it says, "Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door." These are some very strongly worded verses, and they give us a sense of how God feels about grumbling, whether it's in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. Grumbling and complaining seem to produce a strong reaction from God. And so the question is why? And I believe we get insight into that as we continue to read the rest of Philippians chapter 2. And so picking it up in verse 15, it says, I'll read back in 14, "Do everything without grumbling or arguing." And then in verse 15 it says, "So that you may become blameless and pure children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation." And so as I look at this, it tells me that there's something about grumbling and complaining that God finds warped and crooked, And it's like he's saying, if you are going to be my children, if you are going to be part of my family, you don't do this. And it reminds me of like when I was a kid, right? And I would say to my parents, "But my friends," or, "But Joe," or something like that. And they would say, "Well, what's your last name?" Right? Because in this family, we don't do that. And I would hate to hear it, but I almost get the sense God is saying to us that, hey, if you're going to be part of my adopted family, grumbling and complaining are off limits for you. And so the question is why? As I thought about it and meditated on it, I came to this conclusion. And it's this, that grumbling and complaining come from a mind that's not sufficiently trained by faith. And I'm guilty as charged. See, they're lessons that I put together, and they come from a place of conviction. They come from my habits or whatever the case might be. And things that I've held on to for a long time. I feel like as I was writing this lesson and working on it, I was honestly getting like slashed up by the Lord. The best way I could put it is, how in Hebrews 12 it talks about how the scriptures, the word of God, judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. I was feeling judged. Like, it's like, okay, all right, I am so convicted right now. And I'm not sure how you're feeling as you hear this, but I know that for me, I realize it's easier to grumble and complain than to learn, well, what's the proper response of faith, right? If this is off the table for God's people, then what's the proper response of faith? And I think it's important, before we delve into that, to really understand the futility of grumbling and complaining. Here are some things that show the futility of it. Okay, grumbling and complaining. 1, steals joy. Okay, when we grumble and complain, our joy doesn't increase; it decreases. Oh yeah, it could feel good to vent and get it out. But I've never really known people who are like really joyful people to be complainers. There's an inverse relationship between complaining and joy. the more you have of the one, the less you have of the other. Um, Another thing, grumbling and complaining quenches the spirit. Think about it for a second. Joy is a fruit of the spirit, okay? And if we've got something that steals joy, then it's working in opposition to the spirit. It's undermining what the spirit wants to produce in you. And so grumbling and complaining quenches the work of the spirit in your life. Another thing that grumbling and complaining accomplishes is this: it diminishes blessings. It is a sobering thing to consider that the generation of Israelites who left Egypt didn't make it into the promised land. And when you start to do the post-mortem on what were the things that resulted in that, one of the primary things that comes out is their grumbling and complaining. And God, in one of those incidences, I absolutely will not let a single man or woman of this generation make it into the promised land. God feels strongly about this issue. And so when we look at grumbling and complaining, the fact that it steals joy, that it quenches the spirit, that it diminishes blessings, it's like, okay, so well, what's the value in it? Well, here's the thing. It actually changes little. There are two things really that, the stuff we grumble and complain about. There's stuff that we can't change. Think about it. There are a lot of things that you and I complain about, that if we were really honest with ourselves and ask the question, hey, does my complaining about this actually change it? In a lot of situations I can think of personally, it doesn't. And in some of these things, is there anything that I can actually do to change this situation? The answer is no. Is there anything I can actually do to change this person? The answer is no. And so there's a great deal of things that we grumble and complain about that we cannot actually change, and that our grumbling and complaining actually doesn't change. And then, of course, there are things where if you examine it, yeah, there's stuff that we can do that will change it. But if that's the case, then we need to stop grumbling and complaining and just start doing something and changing the situation. Um, Instead of grumbling and complaining, as we go about whatever way you want to go about changing the situation, it needs to be a godly way. But as we talk about this whole thing of not grumbling and complaining, let's talk about the alternative. Okay, instead of grumbling and complaining, what do we need to do? We need to learn to embrace and pursue the proper response of faith. Okay, one proper response of faith we see highlighted in Psalm 142. I'll read from verse 1 to 2. It says, I cry aloud to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy. I pour out before him my complaint. Before him, I tell my trouble. Think about how our grumbling and our complaining comes out of the overflow of our hearts, right? When they get filled with frustration. But the psalmist here says that he pours out his complaints before the Lord, right? And so instead of it coming out and grumbling and complaining under our breath or to other people, he pours it out before the Lord, and this is a legitimate thing that God loves. He loves when we pour out our frustrations to him, when we cast our anxieties on him. These are things that he loves. It's the opposite of grumbling and complaining, and I'm talking about prayer. One proper response of faith is to spend time praying, not complaining. See, when we grumble and complain, right, we already looked at it. It steals joy. It quenches the spirit. It diminishes blessings, and it changes little. But with prayer, we've got the opposite. Prayer does more than we can imagine, right? It increases faith. It fills with the Spirit, and it leads to increased blessings. If we've got a choice between the two, I understand if we don't know much about God, but if you and I, as people of God, have a choice between the two, which should we choose? Which should we choose? We should, of course, choose the one that's more profitable. Um, you know, another proper response of faith is to search the scriptures for what God has said about the cause of your frustration, irritation, anger, your challenge. Maybe for you, you're dealing with an unreasonable boss. Then instead of grumbling and complaining, because we got to put those out of our realm of possibilities. Instead of grumbling and complaining, we've got to search the scriptures to see how to deal with an unreasonable boss. Maybe for you that means, hey, looking at Daniel. He had an unreasonable boss, Nebuchadnezzar, right? I mean, you may think your boss is bad, but your boss is no king. Your boss can't do anything he wants. Nebuchadnezzar asked ridiculous things. And when people said, hey, they can't do it, he said, I'm going to kill you. Right? Until your boss does that, then he's not as bad as Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel is an incredible example of someone with a bad boss who did not complain and yet was able to deal with that situation in the way that God prescribes. Maybe as you search in the scriptures and you decide, I'm not going to grumble and complain, and you look at your particular situation, what you'll discover is that maybe you're called to go the extra mile. Or maybe teens, you might be frustrated with your parents, and it's very easy. I've been there to grumble and complain. But as a disciple of Jesus, if you are a disciple, that's not on the table for you. And if you want to be a disciple, that's not on the table for you either. And so maybe what that means is like, hey, how does God say to handle this? Well, the scriptures have a lot to say about obeying your parents, right? And maybe their parents, they're high-fiving and so forth. But hey, parents complain about their kids, right? But that's not on the table for you either as a disciple of Jesus, okay? And so what is on the table? Well, maybe some of the issues and the challenges with your kids go away if you stay close to the things that God has to say about how to handle that situation. Maybe their disrespect disappears if you're not exasperating them, or maybe your situation is, hey, you're called to be a peacemaker. I'm going to complain about this, or this could be a place where I exercise patience according to the scriptures. We got to find what the scriptures have to say about our situation. And then we've also got to find the promises that relate to our situation. And we got to hold on to those things like they're an anchor. We got to hold on to them and beg God for those promises to be realized in our lives. What's really interesting is the guy who wrote this, Paul, he wrote this from prison, right? Philippians, the book that we've been looking at, he's in prison when he writes this. And he's in prison because of his faith, right? He's in prison because he's doing the right thing. If there was ever a guy who would have something to grumble and complain about in that situation, I would say it would be him. But he doesn't grumble and complain. And from him, we get these amazing words that we're to do everything without grumbling or arguing. And then we have the example of our Savior, right? Who faced the cross and did so without grumbling and complaining. And when his heart started to be full, when it started to overflow, what will we see him doing in Gethsemane? He took it to God. He went to God in prayer. See, when we understand this, and if we were to embrace this, and if we were to make the decision to just turn away from grumbling and complaining, when we are able to do that, if we got to a place where we were no longer doing that, I want us to read what Paul says beginning in verse 15. It says, then you will shine among them like stars in the sky. The them is this world, this crooked and depraved world. It says, then you will shine among them like stars in the skies. You hold firmly to the word of life. You know, uh, I worked for 10 years in the insurance industry. Always, um, as a disciple, you want to impact your coworkers. You want to bring people out to church. You want to see them become disciples. And I was never able to help anyone become a disciple at my job. And I really obviously made an effort to do that. I wanted to be a good example. I didn't swear at work or any of that type of stuff. I don't swear at home either. But I the um, I would try to not be involved in any of the off-color jokes or things of that nature. Try to set an example in so many different ways. But as I look back and as I think about it, man, this idea, this area of not grumbling and complaining was just so under my radar because I was right in there with everybody. I complained just as much as everybody else. And I wonder how much that made my light not shine, right? Because Paul says, then you will shine among them like stars in the sky. I believe the shining is to God, but I believe it's also to other people. See, when Paul and Silas originally went to Philippi and preached the message there, they got arrested. Not only were they arrested, they were physically beaten. And they're sent into, they're put in prison. Their feet are they're bound, all that type of stuff. They're bruised all over the place. And the Bible records that they were at midnight praying and singing hymns to God. If you could imagine what I think they ought to do, what I think they would have been, other people would have expected them to be doing, is to be grumbling and complaining. I'm sure every other prisoner in there was complaining about something. And here are these guys who, on top of being imprisoned, have been physically abused. And here they were instead praying and singing to God. And of course, if you're familiar with the story, when the life of the jailer gets turned upside down because the earthquake opens all the doors, who does he turn to? It's to Paul and Silas. He doesn't say to any of the other prisoners, hey, I want to be like you. It's to Paul and Silas. He says, hey, teach me how to be saved. Whatever it is you guys have, I want it. Peter told the wives of non-Christian husbands that the way to win them over was not with their words, but with a gentle and quiet spirit. A gentle and quiet spirit, that's the opposite of a grumbling and argumentative spirit. See, perhaps this is the way that we impact our coworkers. Imagine if we didn't grumble and complain against each other. Imagine if in the church we didn't grumble and complain against one another. Wouldn't that build unity in the church? And there's a thing about unity that Jesus says in John 17. It was his conviction. I would think that Jesus knows what he's talking about. But it was his conviction that if we were unified, that it would convince the world that he was from the Father. Okay? That, hey, how do we convince an atheist? You show him our unity. We have kids who are growing up in our households and we want to impress the faith on them. How do we convince them that this Jesus thing, that we're a part of this Jesus thing that we believe is actually true? Well, according to Jesus, hey, we show them our unity. How do we shine like a star in the world? According to what Paul writes in Philippians, is, hey, we don't grumble and complain. I want us to think about ourselves, and maybe you've thought about these things before, maybe you haven't, but if this is something you've considered or you're considering now for the first time, think about yourself as being in a fork in the road, right? See, it's hard to be shining when you're whining, right? And think about yourself as being in a fork in the road. And on the one side is where everybody goes, where most of us have spent a lot of time. And it's the road of complaining, and it's the road of arguing, and it's the road of grumbling. But on the other side is a different road, a road, for lack of a better term, that is far less traveled, right? And imagine if you made the decision. If you made the decision that for you, I don't care what anybody else does, but for you, for me, I'm gonna turn around and I'm not gonna do this grumbling and complaining thing anymore. I'm gonna learn how to live without that. You know, um, imagine what could happen if you've rejected grumbling and complaining. Imagine how your Father in heaven would feel about you, his son or daughter, deciding, I'm not going to be like this crooked world, right? Imagine how much you would shine at work. Imagine the impact on the people who are around you, who just might take notice. Imagine who might be won over by your example. Maybe it's your kids. Maybe it's your friends at school. Maybe it's your spouse. Or maybe it's your coworkers. I'm not sure where we're all at, but as I close out our time here for midweek, I just want to lay these thoughts before you and encourage you to really take this road that is less traveled, to make this decision. That's a small decision. It's hard. But nevertheless, it's a decision that could have a tremendous impact on our lives and the lives of people around us. And so as we close out our time, I hope you have benefited from what we've shared tonight. And thank you for tuning in and joining us. Have a great evening. Good night.